Welcome back to RPG Maniacs, where we like our RPGs the way we like our peanut butter. I'm your host Toya, and today we are going to talk a little bit more about action RPGs. Where we last left off in 1987, Falcom's Xanadu had just become the best-selling Japanese PC game of all time, ported to every standard under the rising sun, and influencing numerous developers from Nintendo to Konami and Hudson Soft. After Xanadu came Zelda and Zelda 2, and after Zelda came Xanadu. But this was not the end of the story. Far from it, Xanadu was only the beginning. The 1980s saw a number of developers experimenting with different perspectives and gameplay styles for action RPGs, from profile view side-scrolling to three-quarters perspective, and 1987 in particular saw a huge influx of action RPGs like Zeliard, Golvelius, and Simon's Quest. But the watershed game of '87 is one that few Westerners have heard of and fewer still have played. Falcom's PC '88 game, Ancient Ys Vanished Omen. While many lesser-known action RPGs like Terranigma or Seiken Densetsu 3 were simply not published overseas, all of the Ys games up until the fourth numbered title had English localizations in both North America and in Europe, and these localizations were very high quality for the time they were released in, with the international script expanded by director Iwasaki Hiromasa to create a polished experience that he would later call more definitive than even the Japanese version. The problem was that the international versions of Ys were published exclusively on the PC Engine and Sega Mark III, or as they were known in the US and UK, the TurboGrafx 16 and Sega Master System. Consoles that nobody owned. It's unfortunate because the early Ys games make for a fascinating study in game design, and the staff that worked on them went on to have incredible careers in the game industry. Several staff from the first three Ys games went on to work at the development studios Quintet and Shade, creating innovative new titles like Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and Grandstream Saga. Ys itself began on the PC '88 personal computer, much like Xanadu before it, and had ports to the Sharp X1, PC '98, FM7, and MSX2. Its 1988 sequel, Ys 2: The Final Chapter, had a similar publication history, and both games were eventually compiled into the 1989 Comprehensive Definitive Edition, Ys Book 1 and 2 for the NEC PC Engine. This is the version of the game that the world remembers, and it is the version we are playing today. Now, when I say game design, I'm referring both to how items and treasures are placed throughout the game relative to the challenges the player faces, and to how the bosses and battle system are crafted. Ys uses the same bump combat system that we saw back in Xanadu, what Japanese players refer to as taiatari, or tackling. Only Ys is polished to function at a much higher speed. Rather than having an attack button like in Zelda or Final Fantasy Adventure, the player damages enemies by touching them at an offset. If the player hits the enemy head-on, then their character will also take damage, while striking at an angle damages only the opponent. With this property in mind, consider how the first boss of Ys is set up. This is Genocress, the wizard barring the player from going into the first dungeon's lower levels. Genocress does not attack the player directly, but instead teleports around the room, leading the player into the line of fire of one of his 6 torches. Each torch has a maximum range of about 8 tiles, crossing just past the halfway point of the room. If 2 flames touch, then one of them will immediately recede, so that there is always at least one space to move freely between any 2 torches. Thus, the player is challenged to watch and anticipate the torches Genocress is luring them into, and find the one path that will let them ram Genocress while still having the free movement to escape the torches unscathed. This first boss battle teaches the player the importance not just of attacking, but of evading and having an escape route from every attack they initiate, and it's an element that later boss battles repeatedly revisit with their new play attributes. Ys is a game which revolves around its boss battles. The wandering monsters raise the player's level so that they can damage the bosses. The equipment they find helps them endure the boss's attacks, and the items they recover serve as keys to the boss's layers. Each of the game's 7 bosses is designed to explore one facet of the bump combat system. Genocress begins by teaching the player the importance of attacking safely rather than recklessly. The second boss, Nigtilger, chases the player around its chamber, attempting to ram them head-on, but only Nigtilger's head can deal damage. Any other segment of the body can be struck for full damage. This is where the high-speed nature of Ys's combat system first shines through. The player and enemy are both chasing one another while simultaneously trying to avoid their hurt boxes, creating a tornadic combat flow where both parties circle more and more narrowly, while one wrong move forces them to break apart and begin the chase anew. The third boss, Vajulian, is where most players get stuck. Vajulian is conceptually similar to the Yellow Devil of Rockman fame. The boss begins as a single enemy, then splits into many individual bats that rhythmically swarm the player in an attempt to damage them. Vajulian is only vulnerable in its unified form, and only for a few frames at a time, and if the player bumps too far into Vajulian's body, then they will take damage in turn. Approaching this boss as they did Genocros or Nigtilgar will only lead to a swift game over. The pattern is to hang close to the swarm, teasing it into attacking the player and then quickly dart away as it closes in, repeating this until Vajulian reforms and the player can lightly tap him for damage. This follows the general idea of making safe attacks that Genocros taught, but with the twist that the swarm can feint the player by pretending to reform and stopping partway through, then attacking the off-guard player. This specific behavior was created by Hasegawa Hiroshi, one of the game's two main programmers, as a way of discouraging the player from puppy guarding the boss. The closer the player is to Vajulian when he reforms, the more likely he is to feint. This is the last boss fought before the player enters Dharm Tower and begins the second half of the game. Once the player enters Dharm, they can't get back out, and they need to have the silver equipment to defeat the final boss, so Vajulian has incredibly high stats relative to when he first appears in order to act as an equipment check on the player, more or less requiring them to have the silver sword to damage it and the silver shield and armor to weather its attacks. This is made possible by Ys's approach to leveling. This game marks the beginning of Falcom's rubber band approach to levels, where the experience enemies give scale with the player's character level so that as they defeat enemies in new areas, their character level snaps to what it should be, and then doesn't budge further as experience downscales to just 1 point per monster. It's deeply impractical for the player to level grind beyond the level they should be compared to simply seeking out the silver equipment. This also ensures that each boss can be tuned for a specific level progression. The fourth boss, Pictimos, is built around a set of rules rather than a specific pattern. The boss can only move horizontally and throws out up to 3 sickles at a time, which follow a boomerang motion out to the walls of the arena and then return to the main body. Unlike the last two bosses, Pictimos deals no contact damage. The sickles home in on whatever position the player is standing in at the moment they're fired. Thus, the player is pressured to put distance between themselves and Pictimos until it sends out the first sickle, then make a run for the main body as it sends out the next two, ideally outpacing all 3 of them and having enough time to score multiple hits against it. Like Vajulian, Pictimos cannot be wholly predicted, as the motion of the main body is subject to random determination. It has enough variation to be unpredictable, but it rewards observations of its pattern and movement, and introduces projectiles to the gameplay, setting the stage for the bullet hell attack patterns the series would later develop. The fifth boss, Consklard, is the only boss in the first Ys game that Iwasaki felt the need to adjust directly, and even that couldn't save it. Consklard is meant to teach players to maneuver around projectiles following their path to damage the boss, and unfortunately boils down to a test of how precisely the player can use the D-pad. But it could be worse. It could be the sixth boss, Yaglex and Amalgan. The overall concept of this battle is fairly straightforward. Only the red head takes damage, and every time it's damaged, it instantly swaps places with the purple head. Both heads are surrounded by rings of fireballs, which orbit them in opposite directions. The player is expected to quickly dart between the fireballs as they get an opening, strike the head, and come out of the ring unscathed by adjusting their position as they leave the boss behind. This fight demands a level of pixel-perfect precision found nowhere else in the game, but bizarrely becomes easier as the player starts to get an advantage, rather than ramping up in difficulty. As Yaglex and Amalgan lose hit points, they also lose fireballs, 1 per every quarter of their HP taken off. Generally, boss fights will escalate in challenge the further the player can make it, so that passing through the first phase establishes that they're ready for the next. Instead, the player starts the battle already able to handle the last phase, which causes the tension to disappear as the fight goes on. Yaglex and Amalgan start out disproportionately difficult relative to the rest of the game, but they rob the player of any sense of accomplishment by ending on a denouement. So not all of the bosses are winners. Consklard is too easy, while the Jackie Chan Oni rejects here are way too difficult relative to the rest of the game. With 2 badly designed bosses in a row, the final hours of Ys can feel like a slog. Thankfully, the 7th and final boss of Ys is both the culmination of everything the bump combat system represents and one of the best designed boss battles in any 2D video game. Dark Fact moves along a set path, tracing a rough figure 8 out over the arena. Every time the player succeeds in damaging Fact, the tile they hit him on is destroyed. It's easy to avoid, but if the player is standing on that tile, they die instantly. The resulting pits become impassable, so the more damage the player does to Fact, the more ruined the arena becomes, and the harder it gets to maneuver. Effectively planning around hitting Fact on the corners and edges early on will lead to the player's movement being less restricted as the fight progresses. In addition to the instant death pits, Fact periodically sends out 1 to 2 fireballs that explode in 8 directions. The real challenge of the battle is to simultaneously move around the pits while avoiding attacks that go out in double the number of directions the player is capable of moving in. The frequency of these fireballs grows as the fight progresses, building dramatic tension through gameplay. And unlike every other boss in the game, Fact cannot be defeated with brute force alone. The player must have all of the silver equipment equipped to damage him, making a small puzzle of the boss wherein simply going for the highest numbers isn't enough to win. This was just a year after players were throwing turnips at Wart and making Bowser jump through his own floor. The complexity of this battle is insane, and the fact that the original version of it debuted just a year after players were slowly poking Ganon to death boggles the mind. The battle with Dark Fact never feels cheap or unfair to the player. They always know exactly why they died, how they could have avoided it, and what they need to do to prevent that from happening again. All of the individual elements of Ys, making safe attacks and leaving lines of retreat open, adjusting to changing terrain, attacking at offsets and avoiding projectiles, come together in this one battle that makes an otherwise disjointed game become cohesive. This is Ys in 10 minutes, a series of boss battles punctuating high-speed dungeon crawling. What I can't emphasize enough is that this game was visually and orally arresting when it debuted, being one of the only 16-bit RPGs in the market, and the only one released internationally with CD-quality audio and voice acting. It even predates some 8-bit classics like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest III. If the PC Engine had been successful internationally, Ys would be etched into our collective nostalgia in the same way that the classics of the Super Nintendo are. And it's arguably a much better game than a sizable portion of the RPG canon, but it also only makes up half the contents of Ys 1 and 2, and the second half of the duology is unfortunately a much weaker game. On a gameplay level, Ys 1 is about melee combat, while Ys 2 is about magical combat, giving the player 7 spells and a nearly bottomless supply of mana to cast them from. Unfortunately, this turns the game into something of a grindy shmup, with most bosses being completely immune to physical attacks and several among them being about as poorly designed as Consklard. Given that it was 89, you could probably forgive Falcom for being a little too ambitious and not really being able to top the finale of the first game. Ys 2 was unfortunate, and what happened after it was tragic. After company president Kato Masayuki forced them to develop an unrelated side-scrolling action RPG into the Ys Gaiden game Wanderer from Ys, and rebranded it Ys 3 at the 11th hour for marketing purposes, and issued an ultimatum that the staff could only develop PC games and could not code for console, Ys director Hashimoto Masaya and scenario writer Miyazaki Tomoyoshi resigned, along with most of Falcom's senior staff, leaving to found the independent studio Quintet. Those employees that did not join Quintet nor remain at Falcom joined Enix, and eventually even junior staff members like Yokota Koji would find themselves joining Hashimoto and Miyazaki. The end result of this was that Ys 4 was outsourced to multiple different companies simultaneously, and ended up being made for console anyway, but by unrelated staff, with the Hudson Soft version being the most positively received. The fifth game was made in-house, exclusively for the Super Famicom, but developed by inexperienced staff members that lacked familiarity with the series. And after the market confusion over the fourth games and the negative reception of the third and fifth titles, the Ys brand was largely forgotten by the general public, with only remakes to sustain it until Falcom sought to revive the franchise in the 21st century with Ys 6, The Ark of Napishtim. Thus, the Ys series died just as it was coming into its own, and it wasn't until the 2000s that this 80s franchise finally began to get recognition and global reach. Nonetheless, the lessons that Ys taught about game design and the structure of an action RPG endured in the works of Quintet and those designers that grew up with the original game. We owe a great deal to Ys, so should you play it? The parts of Ys that it does well, it does very well, but the balance issues surrounding some of its bosses come close to spoiling the whole experience, and most players will probably give up before they've seen the peak of the mountain. I would say that Dark Fact alone makes Ys a journey worth taking, but if you can't make it past Vajulian, then there may not be much point. This has been Toya. Thank you for joining me today. If you liked what you saw, please consider liking and subscribing to support the channel. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Pillowfort at Towoya, on Twitch at DecodeToya, and of course, right here at RPG Maniacs.